Hey guys, just let me know when you can hear me so that we can get started here. Yep, looks like the video's actually working and rolling there. Sweet. Alright guys, give me like 2 more seconds here. I just gotta bring up what I need to bring up. Should have had it ready. I am sorry. That's not what I want. Sorry, give me another minute. Alright, bringing over the slides here for you guys. So, let's get rolling here, just so we can kind of try to get done in a reasonable hour here. No thanks. Okay, so we were talking about the American Revolution, right? The American Revolutionary era, essentially the lead up to the American Revolution, and ultimately the things that you need to know about the war itself as well. So let's kind of just look in general at the things that you are supposed to know, the way Virginia sees it, right? So we're talking about the political ideas and about the relationship between the people and the government, which we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence, right? That these people ultimately instituted the foundations for the government which we live today, at the time period, with what comes out after the American Revolution, and then ultimately that the Enlightenment ideas, right, especially of people like John Locke and things, are going to be some of the big things that are going to be driving all of that, right? So when it comes down to it, there's going to be some contradictions as well, right? Your contradictions in the Declaration of Independence versus the realities of slavery and the undemocratic nature of that, for sure. The Enlightenment, keep going. All right, let's just keep going in here. Okay, so this is your map ahead of time, right? I'll answer your question as we get to that point, okay, Grayson? Flip this. I don't know why it's taking forever to load up here. There we go. Alright, so let's take a look at our map, right? This is our pointer. This is roughly what the colonies looked like ahead of time, right? Right, kind of prior to the American Revolution, this is what North America looks like. You have the British colonies over here. You've got the French colonies kind of in blue here in the middle, and then you have the Spanish, what they call the borderlands, down here to the south. As you can see, the French kind of worked their way in down the Mississippi River. The British kind of started right in Virginia and then Massachusetts, and then kind of expanded outwards from there. And that's the Spanish had come up from Mexico from the conquests that you guys should be familiar with at this point, right? So we have that rivalry, which you can see on that map, right? You have the rivalry between these different countries, and the big thing is, the rivalry between the British and the French. So I'm going to go back to the map here, right? So as the British expanded westward, as the coast got more crowded, as we kind of did in that little activity in class, the French kind of started working their way eastward, too, into this area called the Ohio River Valley, which is this pretty nice area, this fertile area that would have been ripe for the settlement, right? So we kind of get this rivalry between these two groups, and just also in Europe, right? The French and the English never really got along too well when it really comes down to it. So what's going to happen is you're going to get this kickoff of this war out in western Pennsylvania, partially with George Washington, who's going to be out there, which we talked about a bit in class, but that's kind of going a little bit further than we need to know as far as your test is going to go. And as a result, you're going to get this conflict, and you're going to get the French and Indian War, right? Mostly due to how close they were to one another and how close the proximity was to the different groups, right? So the French and Indian War starts off, and the French and Indian War is what basically kicks off what becomes known as the 7 Years' War between the different groups. And as we kind of said, the British were in western Pennsylvania, and the French and the natives that they teamed up with are going to essentially whoop those people, the Brits over there. George Washington, it's not going to go well in the beginning stages here, and even a year or so later. And these initial failures in western Pennsylvania, and then even upstate New York, ultimately forced the British politicians and things in England to kind of take a second look at this conflict and realize that they need to ultimately put a little bit more effort into it, right? And they need to prioritize the war. So they do, and you're going to get this sending over of kind of better generals. You're going to kind of getting people, the British buying weapons from the colonists and buying supplies for the war effort from the colonists. And ultimately, with this kind of reprioritization of the war by the English, and enough time and enough energy expelled by the colonists who were doing the bulk of the fighting, in addition to some of the Brits that had come over, the British are going to get rid of the French. They're going to kind of fight them off. They're going to fight this kind of climactic battle up in Quebec, and that's going to be kind of it for the war, at least in North America. However, the war is going to continue for a number more years over in Europe, for sure. Right? So now we have this war. Now the colonists were forced to fight this war. And as a result, the British, who had now spent a lot of money on this war and resources on this war, they wanted to kind of recoup some of their losses, right? So in order to pay the cost, essentially, of the war, what they end up start doing is kind of start effectively taxing the colonists. And you get these taxes that are now being implemented, or re-implemented anyway, on things like sugar, which is going to be the first one. And then from sugar, when you get colonists kind of rebelling against that, or I shouldn't really say rebelling yet, but protesting against that, you have the repeal of the Sugar Act, and then ultimately you get the Stamp Act, and then the Tea Act, and all sorts of other different acts that are going on by the British. But when it comes down to it, it's taxes that are being put on the colonists that the colonists aren't necessarily happy of, mostly as a result of not having any direct representation in Parliament to have any say over the matter at all. The Stamp Act, to answer your question there, Maya, was a tax, essentially, on legal documents, things like diplomas and marriage licenses and deeds and things like that. And ultimately, what happened was they stamped it, right? And that was going to signify that they had paid the tax. And you can see the stamp that one of the stamps anyway that was used, just kind of right there on the slide, right? So another thing that the British did at the end of the war, the French and Indian War, right? One of the other things that they do is this thing known as this Proclamation Line, and what they do is they draw this line basically down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and they actually say that you can't settle west of this anymore. And a large reason of that was because of the Native Americans and dealing with the Native Americans, who were getting a little hostile, if you will. Say hello to the cats, who has a cone on because he's scratching something on his neck. But anyway, right, so you have this line that's drawn. Sorry, this cat's going to keep getting in my way a little bit. But you have this line that is drawn, essentially, that the British prevent the colonists from settling over there, right? And again, mostly as a result of the Native Americans and the fighting and conflicts that have kind of arisen as a result of that. And on the frontier there. So the colonists aren't particularly thrilled about this proclamation, and that's mostly as a result of they just fought this war for this territory, and when it comes down to it, they can't not being able to go there, it makes them frustrated, right? They put a lot of effort and blood and sweat and tears into the war, the fighting, and it makes sense that they would be able to go there, at least in their mind, right? But not according to the British, okay? So you get resistance build to the British, especially in very patriotic places like Boston in particular, right? And you're going to get the Boston Massacre that occurs. Other words, becomes known as the Bloody Massacre, in this kind of propaganda effort by the people in Massachusetts, in particular Paul Revere, who is the one that made this poster. But remember, the poster, mentions the Bloody Massacre, and it kind of just shows an innocent crowd being fired upon by by the Brits here, but we know, we talked about it in class, and we saw the John Adams segment, that it's not so cut in stone, and not so cut, and it's not so much just the British fault, right? We know that the American colonists were provoking the British in every single sense of the word, throwing snowballs with rocks in them and things like that, mocking them and calling them names, and obviously, of course, the British did ultimately fire, but the colonists weren't necessarily completely not at fault for sure. But anyway, this sparks this huge resistance, and you get this uproar in the colonies over this, mostly as a result of this propaganda piece that spreads around the colonies, and that's going to be a big factor of all of it, right? So other resistance you get, right? You get the Sons of Liberty. You have the Sons of Liberty that hold this Boston Tea Party, right? And you have this shipment of tea that comes into the Boston Harbor in 1773, and basically they dump all this tea in protest of the taxes and the Tea Act and things like that, and the British get really pissed off at this point, right? Because in the British's mind, what they've been doing is kind of trying to work with the colonists, and every time the colonists were upset about a particular tax, they would say, well, okay, we can figure out a different way to tax you guys instead. And the Americans really are just like, well, we just don't want to be taxed at all when it comes down to it, right? Without the representation in Parliament and things like that, right? So you have about 150 men kind of come and dump tea into the Boston Harbor in what was known as the Boston Tea Party, and that's going to be more of this resistance. And remember, in class, we also watched the pieces of John Adams, that the show from HBO, right, showing the tarring and feathering and things like that, right, which are just show that the American colonists were somewhat at fault here, right, and the American colonists were not 100% the good guys, right? That they did some pretty horrible things in certain cases to some of these British officials to kind of get their point across, and arguably terroristic kind of ways, things, right? So anyway, moving on, we have the First Continental Congress, right? So after all of this, and the British ultimately shut down Boston Harbor as a result of the Boston Tea Party, you're going to get the colonies kind of meet as a group of colonies here in what's known as the First Continental Congress. And they're going to kind of debate on how to handle the situation, right? So all the colonies except Georgia are going to be represented, and ultimately what they're going to decide is to boycott British goods for the most part, right? That by boycotting these goods where the taxes are on, the British are not going to be able to collect any taxes, and it's going to hurt the British bottom dollar. So I'm not 100% sure why Georgia wasn't represented. So you don't need to worry about that too much for the test or anything. But I'll see if I can figure that out for you and kind of let you know in class tomorrow. So anyway, so kind of moving along the line here, right? You had these two battles that are known as Lexington and Concord now that are going to kind of kick off the war. Right, you have the Americans and these patriots, anyway, if you will, kind of collecting weapons and things in case a conflict kind of breaks out. The British get wind of it, and they are going to send a contingent of their men out to Concord to basically seize these weapons, right? And when they are on their way out there, you're going to get a number of American militiamen, also known as Minutemen, kind of stand in the way and stop the British advance, and we watched that clip of the part of the America, the Story of Us, right? And so the Americans step in the way, right, at this place called Lexington, which is on the way to Concord, and you get this fight, right, that ensues. We don't really know quite what happened, or well, we know what happened, we just don't know who shoots first. And if you're a Star Wars fan, everyone knows that Han Solo shot first. It wasn't Greedo. But anyway, again, going back to our real situation here, right? We don't know who shoots first here. We just don't know, and we really probably are never going to know. They're called Minutemen, Brian, essentially because they are able to be ready at a minute's notice, right? So that they can be ready, they can grab their musket and be out and ready to fight at a very quick amount of time, right? So you have this battle, right? And it's going to be known as the shot heard around the world because this is going to kick off the actual American Revolution here, right? And the fight breaks out. There's going to be roughly 400 militia. The British are forced to retreat. Oh, sorry, this is I'm skipping here, right? So the battle erupts at Lexington. No one knows who shoots first. And once the British kind of clear away the American militiamen, that's when they head to Concord. But the American militiamen had actually been able to get everything out. They had enough time with the stalling by the Minutemen, and the British, what they do is they then they want to head back to Boston. So on their way back to Boston, you have more Americans kind of show up, this time with a lot more men, 400, which is what I was saying before, and you get this kind of fight that again happens, and the Americans look pretty good here, and it forces the British back to retreat all the way back to Boston under fire. This is going to be the kind of the official start of the American Revolution, right? So real quick, you have the three different types of colonists, right? You have the patriots, the loyalists, neutrals. Sorry. We obviously have talked about this pretty much. The patriots are just someone that's going to believe in complete independence. Loyalists might remain loyal to the crown because of economic ties they have, or cultural or religious ties. Neutrals, people that just didn't want to get involved, right? And when it comes down to it, the neutrals are going to make up a large majority of the people, and the patriots are going to be actually a pretty small percentage. However, they're going to be the most vocal, minority here, and this is still going to push the war, right? And then ultimately more and more people get on board as we get a little farther along the way. So the Enlightenment, right? This was a big part of this. It's starting to influence people. Right? It's starting to influence the way they think, scientifically, philosophically, and they're questioning their rulers, they're questioning the relationship to the rulers, and ultimately that's a really important thing, right? So the big dude, right, is John Locke. That's going to influence the early development here, right? John Locke, he's this Enlightenment thinker that really questions, and thinks about self-government, right? And his idea is that these things are his ideas are radical, right? And he's going to kind of challenge the century-old practice of kings and emperors and tribal chieftains, basically saying that people have the ability to govern themselves, right? And that's going to be huge for this time period, again, when we have kings and emperors and absolutism and things. It's a serious, serious thing, right? So John Locke, right, just to kind of sum up his main points, and these are things that are definitely going to show up tomorrow. All people are free and equal and have these natural rights. Natural rights, and what he says, right, are life, liberty, and the property that these rulers are not able to take away. That ultimately the government should be like a social contract with the people. That means the people agree to what the government is meant to do and how it is able to do those things. That the people, right, give the government its power to protect the rights, right, their rights, which is a really important thing. And then ultimately, if the government doesn't act in the best interests of the people, breaking that social contract, if you will, then it's the right of the people to overthrow it, to basically alter or abolish it is the actual terms that's used in the Declaration of Independence, right? Yes, John Locke wrote a number of different things, Maya, for sure. So anyway, the other big dude we talked about was Thomas Paine, who was kind of a bit more of a commoner, if you will, in America here, and he is going to write this pamphlet called Common Sense. And Common Sense, the reason why it's called Common Sense is that it's basically going to say that it's common sense that the American colonies should govern themselves, right? We watched the cartoon in class, the Liberty Kids cartoon, so hopefully you guys remember that. And ultimately, they challenged the rule of the American colonies by the King of England, right? And he made all sorts of different arguments for why the American colonists are able to defend themselves, and able to protect themselves, and ultimately able to govern themselves, right? And this is going to be one of the largest factors that really pushes the revolution in the first place, right? And they had the thought that the American colonies should govern themselves. A lot of people read this and it has a major effect, right? So we get the signing of the Declaration of Independence after a bit more going on, right? So the Declaration of Independence is written by Thomas Jefferson. It's going to reflect the ideas, right, of John Locke and Thomas Paine and other Enlightenment thinkers too, which are going to be more relevant, especially for things like the Constitution, things like separation of powers and things like that. So just to kind of read over a few of these things, which we've gone through now numerous times, right? So the Declaration starts off that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And this is kind of the reiteration of the natural rights, right, that John Locke kind of mentioned, although he does change the wording a little bit from property to the pursuit of happiness, but that's not a big deal. Anyway, so he continues on to say, right, to secure these rights, government are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? And the power of the government comes from the people, right? And this is still that very radical thought for the time period, for sure, right? Power coming from the people and not the ruler? What? Huh? So that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So the thought here, right, is that if the government breaks that social contract that's been established, then it's the right of the people to be able to alter or abolish it, overthrow it if necessary, but within reason, of course. You can't just grab your pitchfork and your torches over every little silly injustice, right? It needs to be within reason, right, because it's a pretty big deal to overthrow a government. But anyway, that the new government, in this case, would be created with the people's interests in mind, right? And that's essentially what they're going to do here once the revolution is set, right, and is done. So in the Declaration, they also do this thing called grievances. They write them out, right? Remember, we compare it to a breakup letter in class, and this is the reasoning why America is breaking up with King George, right? Taxation without representation, quartering of troops in places like Boston without any say of the people that are living there. Closing off the port of Boston completely to the outside world after the Tea Party. The king is, they say, ignore all of these petitions, and there's other things too. And when it comes down to it, many of these grievances are going to coincide with a lot of the things that Thomas Paine was saying in Common Sense, right? So that's pretty important. So, all right, the war. So let's kind of break this down real fast here. So you have George Washington, right? He's chosen as the leader and the general of the Continental Army. And when it comes down to it, his leadership is going to be vital in a lot of ways throughout the actual war. And it's going to, there's going to be a lot of ups and downs, and, partially his fault, but also, a positive way and a negative way here or there. So he starts being dispatched to Boston, right? You get the siege at Bunker Hill, where we talked about in class, but that's going to be going a little bit too far here, a little too intricate for what we need to cover for the test. You have this retreat. So later on after Boston, once George Washington and his men kicked the British out of there, the British returned to New York City through Brooklyn on Long Island, and ultimately to the city, where Washington is then forced to retreat into Pennsylvania. So then down Pennsylvania, he basically makes this surprise attack at Trenton, capturing all of these German mercenaries, right? And then has another kind of that 1-2 punch at Princeton in New Jersey as well. So that's kind of the first part of the war. And the next year, after we get kind of fighting again here, you have another major victory up north by the Americans at a place called Saratoga, which is going to become known as the turning point of the war, and that's going to be super important because it ultimately convinces the French that the cause is worth fighting for them too. They don't like the British enough that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So ultimately, they side with the colonists. They provide them monetary support. They supply them military support and a navy, which is something that the colonies were very much lacking. And as we get going here, even more, and as the war begins to drag on, the British are going to lose a lot of the popular support for the war because more people are dying, more and more money is being spent, and when it comes down to it, Ben Franklin is going to be the one that actively negotiates this treaty with France, him and actually John Adams a bit. Excuse me, sorry. So anyway, so the French are on board, and that's a major turning point in the war, and you need to know that for sure. So after this kind of happens, the British decide to regroup and reanalyze, and one of the things that they do is decide to go south. Okay, so they head south, and what they wanted to do is that in the South, they felt that a lot of people were closer to the British, right? They were a lot more loyalists in the South, So they head there, right? And it goes pretty well for them at first. They take Charleston, South Carolina. They take a good portion of the South, heading north. That was the idea. And when it comes down to it, it's a brutal campaign, right? If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, you have this kind of guerrilla-style fighting by the colonists, and it's pretty rough, right? So as time goes on, the Americans kind of regroup a little bit better and have a better showing, and what's going to happen is you end up getting a large part of the British Army setting up at this place known as Yorktown in Virginia, and it's on the coast essentially, and the hope is that they're going to be able to resupply there. And this kind of is the trap, is essentially a bit of a trap here, because while General Cornwallis is his name, Cornwallis, he's the general, the thought is that he could escape if needed by the British Navy, but they didn't know that the French Navy was on their way, right? And this Battle of Yorktown, with this assault by Washington and his men from the west, then ultimately the closing off of the sea by the by the French against the British, it's going to force them to surrender. And after this, England's going to lose its will to fight on after a number of years, and that's going to be it, right? So they then sign what's known as the Treaty of Paris a couple years later, after all the negotiations, and the Treaty of Paris is now going to recognize the United States as its own nation, right? That's huge, a huge piece of this, right? And then you're going to have the American border set at the Mississippi River, right? So basically the Americans take over the territory of the British colonies completely, except for up in Canada, right? So you're going to get this bit border up here, in Canada, right, in British Canada. That's about it, right? So then this was the battles. Don't worry about these battles too much. What you would need to know from the battles here would be Saratoga, Yorktown, the Treaty of Paris, okay? So you should have those from the work we did in class. You can always look them up again yourself, but we just went over them, okay? So, on that note, what do you guys say we play the quick Kahoot and call it a night? Then you can leave you guys to your studying. You can watch this video as many times as you want. And there's another video more polished of me basically just saying the exact same things we just did. So let's do that. Let me bring up the Kahoot. Alright, you should be able to see it in a second. Weren't there people against Thomas Paine's beliefs? Absolutely there were. That was the thing, right? So there were plenty of people that were still loyal to the crown that were against him, and you guys saw that in the cartoon, right? You saw the loyalists. So if you want to play the Kahoot, join up quick here. Remember, it's kind of finicky with a little bit of a delay, but you should still get about 15 to 20 seconds to answer the questions for you guys. Well, can you guys hear the Kahoot music right now? Alright, so we got 3. Who else is joining here? We have 8 in the stream or so, we will see how many we actually get. So we got 5 at least. Alright, we're going to get started in about 30 more seconds for anyone else who wants to join. If not, I guess that's going to be the end, and my cat is just hanging out on my lap here. Alright, so let's get this Kahoot started. Anyone else who comes back can definitely, there should be a code to be able to get on and get in. Okay, So let's start. Here we go. So, John Locke influenced the American belief in self-government through his writing. What is going on? Why is this so slow? I'm not. Well, the cat's been sitting on my lap. Why did this? My Kahoot died, guys. 1 second. We might have to do it again. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Let's try it again. Alright, we're starting up again. Here we go. John Locke influenced the American belief in self-government through his writing that... Here we go. And you can read the questions yourself. Convinced British government to permit American colonists to vote. Support the elite determining the best form of self-government. Stated the kings ruled through divine right. Or power came from the people and the consent of the governed. The time delay is messing us up. The time delay. Let me see if I can fix something here. Give me 1 more second. Sorry. We can try this again. Sorry, I know this is finicky through the. You know what? This is finicky. Why don't we just play this Kahoot tomorrow in class? Does that work? Instead of the timing, just the delay is messing with us. Yeah, the Kahoot's acting all funky. So maybe what I can do, yeah, let's do the Kahoot in class tomorrow. Sorry it's not working, guys, but if you have any more questions, and if you do, get them out now, and if not, then we can call it quits for the night, and we can go from there. And if not, if I don't see anything in the next 30 seconds or so, I am calling it a night. Good luck studying, everybody. Yeah, good luck. You know where to find all your stuff on Google Classroom. So get there, get studying, watch the video again if you need to. Watch it as many times as you need. And I want you all to do well tomorrow. Okay, so it is a multiple choice test. I'm probably thinking about 30 questions or so, but that's probably up for a little bit of a change here. Okay, night, guys. Have a good one.